Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday, Yom Shishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Erev Shabbos. Yehud in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Shandor in the Bronx, Guy in Ohio, Lorraine in Texas. Belle wishing everyone a happy Shabbos. I always make a smallish challah for the grandkids to tear apart in Texas. Thanks, Salanina. I'm Yisrael Chai. Amen. Welcome, everybody. Let's get to it. Approaching the end of chapter 9 here in Tractate Sanhedrin. It's at the end of today's page. Our daf today's page 83, which we are picking up near the bottom of page 82b, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 9 here in chapter 9. The Mishnah taught, in the case of a priest who performed the temple service in a state of ritual impurity, of tuma, the young of the priesthood kill him. Okay, so we're continuing the discussion of situations where a court-imposed death penalty would not apply. Yesterday we were talking about where we know it's a murderer, for sure it's a murderer. He's going to skate on a technicality from a court-imposed death penalty, but we don't want that person re-entering society. So there was the means of the vaulted chamber, but also there's certain situations where if zealots, sort of go and do what's necessary, the zealots won't be guilty of murder when they perform that execution, as it were. So continuing that theme, when the Holy Temple was standing in Jerusalem, and it hasn't, sadly, tragically, in 2,000 years, and if only all the Jews around the world would cry out to our Father in heaven and say, save us, and connect with God, turn back to God. Some say, and keep Shabbos, 2 Shabbases in a row. Some say even if all of the children of Israel around the world kept Shabbos once, Mashiach would come, the Holy Temple would be rebuilt, there would be peace throughout the world. What are we waiting for? What are we waiting for? Okay, but when the temple was standing, and when it shall be again, maybe soon and speedily in our days, we say amen. So in the case of a priest who performed the temple service while he's tamei, right? So a priest cannot even enter. No person can enter the precincts of the Holy Temple when they are tamei, when they are impure, and particularly a priest who has this incredible responsibility on behalf of the whole Jewish people, and indeed on behalf of the whole world, to do the service, the avoda, the worship, the service of worship, right? The work of the worship in the Holy Temple. He's not permitted to do that in a state of impurity. And if he does it in a state of impurity, knowingly, intentionally, well, then he's desecrating the temple service, which harms the whole world. And in light of that, it seems like the younger priests would make sure that never happened again. Right? A priest who performed the temple service while he's tamei, the young of the priesthood kill him. And Rav Acha Bar Huna raised a dilemma before Rav Sheshes. In the case of a priest who performed the temple service in a state of tuma, is he, or while tamei, right? in a state of tuma. So is he liable to receive death at the hand of heaven? Or is he not liable to receive death at the hand of heaven? Right? Sounds like, well, why are we talking about this, extrajudicial zealotry and the young priest killing him? Isn't this something that the Torah would say the priest is excised, right? He receives death at the hands of the heavenly court, which, we've mentioned many times. We're not sure exactly what it means. Shortened lifespan, lack of children, unclear, but not good. Not good. Certainly you do not want to receive charis, death at the hands of the heavenly court. But isn't that the punishment for a priest who performs a service while he's tamei? So Rav Sheshes said to him, you learn the resolution of that dilemma from the Mishna itself. As we learned in the case of a priest who performed the temple service in a state of tuma, his priestly brethren do not bring him to court for judgment. Rather, the young of the priesthood remove him from the temple courtyard and pierce his skull with pieces of wood. And if it enters your mind to say that he is liable to receive charis, death at the hands of heaven, well then let the young of the priesthood leave him alone, so that he will be killed by the hand of heaven. So rather, what must one say? He is not liable to receive charis, not liable to receive death at the hands of the heavenly court. Rav Acha bar Huna rejects this proof. Is there any act for which the Torah absolves him of the death penalty, and we shall arise and execute him? Why are the young members of the priesthood arising and killing their brother for doing this crime if it's not a death penalty offense? So Rav Sheshes said to him, and are there not cases where one is executed even though the Torah absolves him? But didn't we learn in the Mishna, one who was flogged for violating a prohibition, and then he repeated the violation, the court places him into the vaulted chamber. So there too, the merciful one absolves him of the death penalty, and we execute him. As we learned, the vaulted chamber is not like, going to prison for a finite amount of time. It's basically a death penalty. And Rav Acha bar Huna rejects this proof. But doesn't Rabbi Yirmiyah say that Reish Lakish says we are dealing with lashes administered for violations of prohibitions punishable by charis? As in that case, the man is essentially liable to be punished with death at the hand of heaven. It's because he violated a prohibition that is punishable by charis repeatedly that we put him in the vaulted chamber. So charis applies. Are we going to say that for this crime, that the priest who serves while he's tamei, that charis doesn't apply, and yet the other priests are going to kill him? So Rav Sheshes said to him, but isn't there the case of one who steals a kasva, which is one of the vessels of service in the holy temple? And he is exempt from punishment by Torah law, and the Mishna says that zealots strike him. So Rav Acha bar Huna rejects this proof as well. He says, but doesn't Rav Yehuda say we are dealing with a service vessel utilized in the temple, and the fact that one who steals a service vessel is liable to be killed by zealots is intimated in the verse, that they shall not come to see the sacred items as they are being covered, lest they die. Rav Sheshes said to him, but isn't there the case of one who curses the sorcerer, who is exempt from punishment by Torah law? And the Mishnah says that zealots strike him. Rav Acha bar Huna rejects this proof. But didn't Rav Yosef teach that the reference is to a case where one says, let the sorcerer strike his sorcerer, which appears to be like one who is blessing, which is a euphemism for cursing. Basically, he didn't use the exact right formulation, but it's clear that he committed blasphemy. Because it wasn't the exact right formulation, no court imposed death penalty. But since the intent was clear, we see that it's a death penalty-like offense, and that's why zealotry would apply. You can't use that as a proof to say that something that does not bear a death penalty would result in this zealotry, like this priest who serves while tamei. So Rav Sheshes said to him, but isn't there the case of one who engages in intercourse with an Aramean woman who is exempt from punishment by Torah law? But the Mishnah says the zealots strike him. But Rav Acha bar Huna rejects this proof also, and he says, didn't they read a verse to Rav Kahana in his dream? And when he related his dream to Rav remembered that which he learned through tradition, that God will excise the soul, that charis does apply to a Jewish man who has intercourse, who engages in intercourse with a non-Jewish woman. So Rav Acha Bar Huna raised an objection to the opinion of Rav Sheshes that a priest who performs a temple service in a state of tuma is not liable to receive death at the hands of heaven. Baraisa teaches, with regard to a priest who pours oil onto a meal offering, and one who mixes the oil into the meal offering, and one who breaks a baked meal offering into pieces, and one who salts the meal offering, and one who waves it toward the altar, and the one who brings the meal offering to the altar, and one who arranges the table of the showbread, and one who removes the ashes from the lamps of the menorah, and one who removes the handful from the meal offering, and one who collects the blood from the slaughter of one of the offerings. If the priest performs any of these sacrificial rites, which are only to be performed within the holy temple, if a priest performs these outside the temple, although there are severe prohibitions with regard to performing the temple service outside the temple, he is exempt from charis. Meaning, a priest who would bring an offering, slaughter an animal and put it on some kind of, made up altar, he's trying to make an offering to God, but doing it outside the holy temple, that is so unauthorized and beyond the bounds of the law that the punishment would be charis. But for these sort of lesser sacrificial rites, if somebody performed them outside the temple, he would clearly have violated a prohibition, but he wouldn't be subject to charis. And one is not liable for their performance. Now at the top of 83a, neither due to non-priesthood, if a non-priest performs one of those rites in the temple, he is not liable to receive the death penalty, nor due to the performance of any of these rites in a state of tuma, nor due to the performance of any of these rites as a priest lacking the requisite priestly vestments, nor due to the performance of any of these rites without the washing of his hands and feet. And the reason for the lack of liability to a death penalty, whether earthly court or heavenly court, is that in all these cases, additional rites must be performed in order to complete the service. They're only partial rites, rites. So one is liable for performing the service outside the temple or performing the service as a non-priest in a state of tuma, etc., only when performing a ritual that completes the service, right? If he performed a ritual that completes an avoda, a service of worship, outside the holy temple, or if a non-priest does it in the temple, or if a priest does it while tamei in the temple, and it completes one of the sacrificial rites, then he would be liable to a death penalty. If he's just doing something partial, he would not. Sorry, it's that time of year for allergies. Okay. Now, from the Baraisa, one may infer, but one who burns the offering on the altar in one of these circumstances, including in a state of tuma, is liable. So what? Is it not teaching that he is liable to receive death at the hand of heaven? And there is proof from the Baraisa to resolve Rav Acha Bar Huna's dilemma. Why did the priests, the young priests, take out a priest who performed the service while tamei and kill him? It's an act of zealotry, but it's based on a charis-bearing prohibition, right? A prohibition for which the violation of it results in charis. There's your proof. We just read it. So the Gemara rejects this proof. No, he is liable for violating a prohibition without the punishment of death. And the Gemara asks, but according to that understanding, as for the non-priest who is mentioned in the Baraisa together with the priest who performs the temple service in a state of tuma, is he too liable for violating a prohibition and not death? If he burns the offering on the altar, it's only a prohibition. It's not a charis-bearing prohibition. But isn't it written, Numbers 18:7, and the non-priest who approaches, meaning the altar to bring a sacrifice, shall be put to death? Pretty straightforward. And the Gemara answers, do not extrapolate the liability of a non-priest from the liability of a ritually impure priest, as this case of ritual impurity, of tuma, is as it is, and that case of a non-priest is as it is. Each situation is discussed independently. The Gemara asks, is that to say by inference that a priest who pours oil onto a meal offering and one who mixes the oil into the meal offering in a state of tuma does not violate even a prohibition? But isn't it taught in Baraisa, from where is a prohibition against pouring the oil and against mixing the oil in a state of tuma derived? It is derived from a verse. As the verse states, they shall be sacred to their God, and they shall not profane the name of their God, for the fire offerings of the Lord, the bread of their God, they offer. Leviticus 21:6. Priests must be in a state of purity, tahora, or in the adjective, they must be tahor when they bring the offerings, not ritually impure, tamei. So the Gemara answers, no proof may be cited from that offering, as the prohibition against performing the temple rites that do not complete the service in a state of impurity is by rabbinic law, and the verse is a mere support, not a Torah prohibition. The Gemara raised an objection from a Baraisa. And these are they who are liable to receive death at the hand of heaven. Okay, so now there's going to be a list of people who, if they violate this prohibition, it would result in kares, excision, death at the hands of the heavenly court. If this is going to include priests who serve while tamei, sounds like we have proof that there is a death penalty associated with it, and that's why it's legit that even though the court doesn't impose that death penalty, these zealous young priests might, as opposed to what was the original contention is that, no, they're just violating a prohibition, and yet we allow the zealots to proceed. So, from this other Baraisa, from Tractate Zevachim, it says, and these are they who are liable to receive kares. And among those enumerated in the list is an impure individual, right? Somebody who is tamei, who performed the temple service. And the Gemara concludes, this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rav Sheshes and proof that an impure individual who performs the temple service is liable to receive kares, and young priests and zealots may kill only one who is liable to receive death at the hand of heaven, not one who is merely violating a prohibition that is not punishable by kares or some other kind of death penalty. New subject. In order to discuss the matter itself, the Gemara cites the Tosefta, which included this Baraisa that we were just mentioning, where the conclusive refutation came from, that one who serves, a priest who serves in the temple while tamei is liable to receive kares. How do we know? And these are they who receive kares. Now we're talking about priests generally. One who partakes of untithed produce, that applies to everybody, not just priests. And a ritually impure priest who partook of ritually pure teruma, right? A priest, he has to be pure, tahor, and the teruma, which is a special tithe separated for priests only, the teruma, the food that is separated as teruma, when he eats it, it must be tahor, ritually pure as well. So a priest who's tamei, but who ate teruma that is tahor, he is liable to kares. And a non-priest who partook of teruma, and a non-priest who performed the temple service, and a ritually impure priest, a priest who's tamei, who performed the temple service, that's what we've been talking about, and a priest who is tamei, who immersed that day, and is waiting for nightfall for the purification process to be completed, that's called the tevel yom, who performed the temple service, right? He immersed, he is tamei, he immersed in the mikvah, which purifies him, but he's not yet ready to serve in the temple. He immerses in the mikveh during the day. He has to wait till that night before his purification process is complete. So technically, he's still tamei, even though he immersed in the mikveh. If he then served in the temple, performed the temple service, it's the same prohibition that he violated. And a priest lacking vestments. He's not dressed like a priest, the required clothing that priests wear in the Holy Temple, who performed the service would be liable to kares. And a priest who has not yet brought an atonement offering to complete his process of tahara, his purification process from being a mitzora or a zav, and a priest who did not wash his hands and feet before beginning the temple service, and priests who performed the temple service while intoxicated with wine, and priests who performed the temple service with overgrown hair on their heads. Right? Most of these are about priests who served in the holy temple when they shouldn't have, or partook of teruma, food that is holy and consecrated only for the use of priests, but while either the food or they were tamei. In other words, priests were violating the requirements of purity and sanctity, would be liable to charis. Not punishment at the hands of an earthly court, but death at the hands of the heavenly court. And the Baraisa continues, but a priest who performs the temple service while uncircumcised, or as an acute mourner, meaning on the day that one of his close relatives dies, or a priest who performs the temple service while seated, they are not punished with death at the hands of heaven, charis. Rather, they are liable for violating a prohibition. They did something wrong, but the punishment for that is not charis. With regard to a blemished priest who performs the temple service, Rebbe says he is punished with charis, and the rabbis, the majority, say he is liable only for violating a prohibition. And now the Torah states the law, or rather, as the Torah states the law, only in the case of one who misuses consecrated property unwittingly, there is a dispute with regard to one who intentionally performed an action of misuse of consecrated property. Right? So, in other words, if something was consecrated, set aside to be brought as an offering or as a gift to the treasury of the temple for its upkeep, now no individual can benefit from that personally. If he did so unwittingly, he has to bring a sin offering. If he did it intentionally, the sin offering would not apply. He'd have to make some kind of atonement. It's unclear what the punishment would be. The Torah says you can't misuse consecrated property, and if you do so unwittingly, you bring the sin offering. But we don't know what the punishment is if you do so intentionally. So that's what they're going to now try to figure out, and they're arguing about it. So with regard to this, Rebbe says he is punished with charis, and the rabbis say he is liable only for violating a prohibition. And the Gemara elaborates, it was taught in the Baraisa that one who partakes of untithed produce, right? So when the temple is standing, there's a very specific tithing procedure for any of the produce that's grown in Israel. Once it's all gathered, the first 2% is given to a Kohen. The owner of the produce can choose which priest, which Kohen, to give that 2% to. The next 10% of the produce is given to the Levites, and he can choose which Levites to give it to. And then the next 10% after that, Meiser Sheni, depending on which year we're in the sabbatical, the 7-year sabbatical cycle, in most years 1, 2, 4, and 5, the next 10% he keeps for himself, but he can only use it, either trade it into money or actually carry it, need it, when he makes his pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festivals, Passover, which is coming up, or Shavuos or Sukkot. In years 3 and 6 of the sabbatical year cycle, it's given to the poor. Meiser Sheni becomes Meiser Ani. It's given to the poor. And in the 7th year of the sabbatical cycle, we're not tithing because we're not harvesting produce. Okay? So only after the teruma, the Meiser Rishon, the first Meiser, the first tithe, and then the second tithe are taken from the produce, does it become permissible to eat the produce. If you eat untithed produce, that's a sin, that's a transgression. So it's taught in Baraisa that one who partakes of untithed produce is liable to receive charis. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this law? And the Gemara answers, as Shmuel says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, from where is it derived that one who partakes of untithed produce is punished with death at the hand of heaven? Charis? It is derived from a verse, as it is written, they shall not desecrate the sacred items of the children of Israel, which they will set apart to the Lord. Tithing. Leviticus 22:15. From the fact that it is formulated in the future tense, which they will set apart, it is clear that the verse is speaking about items that are destined to be separated in the future, i.e. untithed produce from which teruma and tithes will be separated. And the Tana derives the punishment by means of a verbal analogy. The term of desecration, written with regard to untithed produce, is derived from the term of desecration, written with regard to an impure priest who partakes of teruma in Leviticus 22:9. And just as there with regard to teruma, he is punished with kares, so too here with regard to untithed produce, he is punished with kares. But the Gemara challenges this and says, let us derive the punishment by means of a different verbal analogy. Derive the term of desecration written with regard to untithed produce from the term of desecration written with regard to meat left over from an offering after the time allotted for its consumption, known as nasar. We see that in Leviticus 19:6 and 8. So just as there with regard to nasar, he is punished with kares, so too here with regard to untithed produce, he should be punished with kares. And the Gemara answers, it is reasonable to say that he should have derived the punishment for partaking of untithed produce from teruma, as there are many elements common to teruma and untithed produce. Unlike nasar, right, meat from an offering that was left beyond the allotted time for eating the meat of an offering, right? There's certain offerings like sin offerings. Some of the meat of that offering is eaten by the priest, and peace offerings, the meat from that offering that doesn't go up in smoke on the altar, is eaten by the one who brought it. But you only have a certain number of days within which to eat it, and beyond that, you just have to burn it and dispose of it because it's not permitted to eat it. You can't keep those leftovers indefinitely. You have to 2 days usually. So that's the rule of nasar. And if you do eat nasar, sacrificial meat beyond its allotted time, that's a transgression known as nasar. So unlike nasar, they are germane to the laws of teruma. They are not in effect outside of the land of Israel, and both of them can become permitted. As an impure priest, he can immerse in the mikveh and then he can partake of teruma. And untithed produce can become permitted by tithing it, taking teruma and tithes out of it, and then the produce becomes permitted. So in both cases, the term of desecration is formulated in the plural, while with regard to nasar, it is formulated in the singular. Both apply to produce, and neither the law of an offering that was sacrificed with the intent to consume it after its designated time, which is known as pigul, nor the laws of nasar apply in either case. So in other words, if we look at untithed produce and teruma, they have a lot more in common with each other than untithed produce has in common with nasar or pigul. So we should learn out, laws that are kind of missing from being stated explicitly from one, category to the other. We're going to use categories that are much more similar to each other than comparing categories that are less similar. But the Gemara rejects this conclusion. On the contrary, he should have derived the punishment for partaking of untithed produce from nasar, as there are elements common to nasar and untithed produce. Both cases relate to the unfitness of the food, while in the case of an impure individual partaking of teruma, it is the person who is unfit. And in both cases, there is no permission granted by the means of immersion in the mikveh, while in the case of an impure individual partaking of teruma, he can immerse in the mikveh and remove the prohibition. So the Gemara answers, those elements common to teruma and untithed produce are more numerous than the elements that are common to partaking of untithed produce and the prohibition of nasar. And Ravina says there is no need for a tally of common elements, as deriving desecration in the plural by means of a verbal analogy from desecration in the plural is preferable, and that's the comparison between partaking of untithed produce and an impure priest partaking of teruma. The Gemara continues to analyze the Baraisa. From where do we derive that an impure priest who partook of pure teruma is liable to receive kares? It is derived, as Shmuel says. From where is it derived with regard to an impure priest who partakes of pure teruma that he is punished with kares? It is derived from a verse, as it is written with regard to a priest who partakes of teruma, and they shall keep my charge, lest they bear a sin for it, and die therein if they desecrate it. I am the Lord. Leviticus 22:9. By inference, if you do partake of something you shouldn't have, they're going to die. So the Gemara asks, from where is it derived that for partaking of ritually pure teruma, right? Teruma in a state of tahara, yes, the impure priest is liable, but for partaking of impure teruma, no, the priest is not liable, right? If both the priest is tamei and the teruma is tamei, sounds like he hasn't violated a prohibition. And it is derived, as Shmuel says, that Rabbi Eliezer says, from where is it derived that a priest who is tamei, who partakes of teruma that is tamei, is not punished with kares? It is derived from a verse, as it is stated in the verse, and die therein if they desecrate it. And this is to the exclusion of teruma that is impure and already desecrated. It wasn't desecrated by the impure priest who ate it. It's already been desecrated when it became impure. Now we're on page 83b. The Gemara continues in its analysis of this baraisa, this stack of people who are liable to kares, because they were impure and ate something pure, or they served in the temple when they shouldn't have, etc. Now we're deriving how we know that all these people are subject to kares who were in that list. So a non-priest who partook of teruma, right? Teruma, that first 2% tithe from produce, when the temple is standing, that only priests can eat. What if a non-priest ate it? Kares. How do we know? A non-priest who partook of teruma is liable to kares. Rav says a non-priest who partook of teruma is flogged, right? So Rav disagrees, not kares, rather flogged. Rav Kahana and Rav Asi said to Rav, let the master say that he is punished with kares, as it is written, quote, and they shall keep my charge, lest they bear a sin from it, and die therein if they desecrate it. I am the Lord who sanctifies them. No non-priest shall eat of the sacred. A tenant of a priest or a hired servant shall not eat of the sacred. That's Leviticus 22, verses 9 and 10. Sounds like a non-priest who eats the sacred shall die. That would be kares. Based on the juxtaposition between verses 9 and 10, one should say that just as an impure priest who partakes of teruma is punished with kares, so too a non-priest who partakes of teruma is punished with kares. Rav answered them, saying, the phrase, I am the Lord who sanctifies them, ends the matter of death. So the matter of a non-priest who partakes of teruma is not juxtaposed to it. It's a new matter. And the Gemara raised an objection to the opinion of Rav from the baraisa. And these are they who are liable to receive death at the hand of heaven, kares. A non-priest who partakes of teruma. And the Gemara explains, are you raising a contradiction from a baraisa to the opinion of Rav? Rav is a Tana, right? A sage of the Mishnaic period. And as such, he has the authority to dispute the determination of the baraisa. Right? A baraisa is contemporaneous with a Mishna, but not as authoritative as a Mishna. So a Tana, one of the sages of the period of the Mishna, if he was by himself challenging the ruling of a Mishna, he might have a problem. But challenging a baraisa, he could overrule the baraisa. The baraisa continues, the punishment for a non-priest who performed the temple service is death at the hand of heaven, kares. As it is written, you and your sons with you shall safeguard your priesthood with regard to every matter of the altar. And any non-priest who approaches shall die. Numbers 18:7. And that baraisa continues. The punishment for an impure priest who performed the temple service is kares. And the source for this is explained as Rav Chia bar Avin asked of Rav Yosef. From where is it derived that an impure priest who performed the temple service is punished with kares? Rav Yosef answered, it is derived from a verse, as it is written in the context of admonishing priests to avoid impurity. Quote, speak to Aaron and his sons that they shall separate themselves from the sacred items of the children of Israel, that they sanctify to me, and they shall not desecrate my sacred name. I am the Lord. Leviticus 22:2. And Rav Yosef explains, and the Tana derives the punishment by means of a verbal analogy. He derives the meaning of the term desecration, written with regard to an impure priest who performs a temple service, from the term desecration that is written with regard to an impure priest who partakes of teruma. And just as there with regard to teruma, he is punished with kares, so too here, with regard to an impure priest who performs a temple service, he is punished with kares. And now the Gemara questions this and says, well, let us derive the punishment by means of a different verbal analogy. Same punishment, but maybe we should derive it a different way. use the term desecration, written with regard to an impure priest who performs the temple service, and compare it to the term desecration, written with regard to nosar, eating that, sacrificial meat beyond its time. And this would teach that just as there, with regard to nosar, he is punished with kares, so too here, with regard to an impure priest who performs the temple service, he is punished with kares. And we're going to have the same problem, right? Let's compare teruma, an untithed produce, and an impure priest, which has more similarities than meat, right? The Gemara answers, it is reasonable to say that it is from teruma that he should derive the punishment for an impure priest who performs the temple service, as there are many elements common to an impure priest who partakes of teruma and an impure priest who performs the temple service. In both of these cases, and unlike nosar, the problem relates to the body of the priest. Both relate to the priest being impure, and in both the issue can be resolved by the priest immersing in the mikveh. And in both, the term desecration, which you're using to link the two verses, is formulated in the plural, whereas the term desecration that is used in the verse about nosar is formulated in the singular, meaning it's less clear linkage. So let's stick where the term desecration, if we're going to use two verses linked by the same word, let's use that same word should have the same syntax. And the Gemara rejects this conclusion. But on the contrary, it is from nosar that he should have derived the punishment for an impure priest who performs the temple service, as there are also elements common to nosar and the impure priest who performs the temple service. Unlike teruma, both are cases involving sacrificial matters. An impure priest who's bringing, a sacrifice in the temple, doing the service of the temple, he's bringing sacrifices. And what is nosar all about? Sacrifices. Is teruma a sacrifice? No, teruma has to do with tithing and the consecrated food that only priests can eat. But that can be done entirely outside the temple. Nosar and an impure priest serving in the temple, that relates to matters inside the temple. And in both cases, the disqualification of pigul, which is when somebody had a priest had an improper intent even before he brought the sacrifice that he was going to eat it after its time was over. That's called pigul. And nosar, we didn't have that intent to begin with, but he ends up eating it after its time. In both cases, that the meat becomes disqualified. And if he eats it unwittingly, bring a sin offering, intentionally, big problem. The Gemara explains, although the number of elements common to an impure priest who partakes of teruma equals the number of elements common to nosar, still, deriving desecration, the word desecration in the plural, by means of a verbal analogy from desecration in the plural is preferable. So we should derive kares, in this case applies, from an impure priest who either eats teruma or performs a service in the temple. The Baraisa continues, the punishment for a priest who was ritually impure, who was tamei, and who immersed that day in the mikveh. So he started his purification process, but he didn't complete it because he's waiting for nightfall before the purification process will be completed. And before nightfall came, he performed the temple service. His punishment is kares, death at the hands of heaven. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this law? And the Gemara answers, it is derived as it is taught in the Baraisa. Now Rabbi Simei says, from where in the Torah is the allusion with regard to a priest who immersed that day, that if he performed the temple service, he desecrated that service because he's not fully pure yet? It is derived from a verse. As the verse states, they shall be sacred to their God, and they shall not desecrate the name of their God in Leviticus 21:6. If this verse is not written with regard to the matter of an impure priest who performed the temple service, as that law is derived from a different verse, quote, they shall separate themselves from the sacred items of the children of Israel in Leviticus 22:2, then apply it to the matter of a priest who immersed that day and is awaiting nightfall, and before nightfall comes, he performs the temple service. Although he is no longer impure in every sense, the priest remains impure in terms of the prohibitions of partaking of teruma and sacrificial food and entering the temple. And that's why he merits kares when he does that. And the Tana derives the punishment by means of a verbal analogy. He derives the meaning of the term desecration, written with regard to a priest, right? The desecration, which keeps mentioning in Hebrew, chilul, right? Chilul. You've heard that term Kiddush Hashem is one who sanctifies God's name, and Chilul Hashem is someone who desecrates God's name, right? In common usage for us today, who are not priests and the temple is not standing, but if you, as a visible Jew, somebody walking around in a kippah, someone people can tell looking at him, he's a Jew. So if you do something kind and righteous, like, SpongeBob fell over and you picked him up. This is like on the Tonight Show years ago. And there were some yeshiva boys walking by, and it was like a little stunt where they, this SpongeBob character in costume just fell over on the street. And the pedestrians in New York City all just walked by and nobody helped SpongeBob stand up, like a guy in a mascot costume. But there were some yeshiva boys, right? Dressed black pants, white shirts, black kippahs. And when they saw SpongeBob go down, they, hustled over and helped him get up. Kiddush Hashem, right? They sanctified God's name because they are religious Jews who are visibly religious Jews and did a publicly righteous and good deed. On the other hand, if those same boys had walked by and not helped SpongeBob get up, and then people would look at them and say, oh, look at those Jews, they're so callous, they don't care, uncouth, like everyone else walking by. But that would be a Chilul Hashem, or much worse, right? Back in the 80s, there was insider trading scandals, right? Back then, different names. No need to, rehash the names. But we would read in the newspaper, this guy with a Jewish name got caught for insider trading on Wall Street. Makes all the Jews look bad. That's a Chilul Hashem, desecrating God's name. So that's the term that we're using here, Chilul, desecration. Right, and the Tana derives the punishment by means of a verbal analogy, derives the meaning of the term chilul, written with regard to a priest who immersed that day, but nightfall hasn't come yet, and performed the temple service, from the term chilul, written with regard to an impure priest who partakes of teruma. And just as there with regard to teruma, he is punished with death at the hand of, he is punished with kares, so too here, with regard to an impure priest who performs a temple service, he is punished with kares. And the Baraisa continues, and the punishment for a priest who is lacking the requisite priestly vestments, right? A priest has to wear the clothing of a priest when he's serving in the temple. There are 4 required garments, and only those garments is what he should be wearing. A high priest, a Kohen Gadol, has 8 garments that he needs to be wearing all 8 of them when he serves as a high priest, or he would have desecrated the temple service. Right? And the punishment of a priest who is lacking the vestments is kares. From where do we derive this? Rabbi Abahu says that Rabbi Yochanan says, and there are those who determine that this law is a tradition that was cited in the name of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. That's the lineage of the ones who stated this law. What is the law? What is the derivation? How do we know that the punishment is kares? It is stated, you shall gird them with a belt, Aaron and his sons, and you shall wrap the headdresses upon them, and they shall have the priesthood as an eternal statute, and you shall inaugurate Aaron and his sons. Sounds like, okay, well, they have to wear the priestly vestments when they serve. How do we know that if they don't, the punishment is kares? From that verse, and that was Exodus 29:9. So from that verse, it is derived, at a time when their vestments are upon them, their priesthood is upon them. But when their vestments are not upon them, their priesthood is not upon them. Therefore, priests who are lacking the requisite priestly vestments assume the status of non-priests in this respect. And the master says earlier in the Baraisa, a non-priest who performs the temple service is punished with kares. Right? So a priest who is not dressed with the required clothing of a priest, it's like he's not a priest. And we already know that a non-priest who performs a temple service, the punishment is kares. The Baraisa continues, and the punishment for a priest who has not yet brought an atonement offering to complete his purification process from being a zav who had certain kinds of emissions from his body, or a mitzora, one who had had the skin condition tsaras, which was a physical manifestation of a spiritual malady. Before he can serve in the temple again, he has to complete an elaborate purification process, which includes bringing certain offerings. And until he completes that purification process, he may not serve as a priest in the temple. And if he did serve, before he completed the purification process? Kares. And how do we know that? Rav Huna says it is derived from a verse, as the verse states with regard to a woman after childbirth who is obligated to bring an atonement offering, quote, and the priest shall atone for her, and she shall become purified, Leviticus 12:8. He infers, as the verse states, shall become purified, by inference, one concludes that until the priest sacrifices her atonement offering, she is impure to a certain extent. And the master says earlier in the Baraisa, an impure priest who performs a temple service, kares, right? So if you're still impure, kares. If you have not waited till nightfall, kares. And so if you need to finish your purification process by bringing offerings, and you haven't brought those offerings, kares. And the Baraisa continues, and the punishment for a priest whose hands and feet are not washed and who perform the temple service is kares. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this law? And the Gemara answers, it is derived from a verse as it is written, whenever they come to the tent of meeting, they shall wash whenever they come to the tent of meeting, which referred to the tabernacle in the wilderness, which was replaced by the holy temple in Jerusalem, whenever they come to the tent of meeting, they shall wash with water, that they shall not die. Okay, seems pretty cut and dry. And the Baraisa continues, and the punishment for priests who perform the temple service while intoxicated with wine is kares, as it is written, drink no wine, nor strong drink, you and your sons with you, when you come into the tent of meeting, that you shall not die. The Baraisa continues, and the punishment for priests who perform the temple service with overgrown hair on their heads is kares, as it is written, neither shall they shave their heads, nor allow their hair to grow long. Ezekiel 44:20. And it is written thereafter, neither shall any priest drink wine when they enter the inner courtyard. One with overgrown hair on his head is juxtaposed to priests who are intoxicated with wine. Just as priests who are intoxicated with wine are punished with kares, so too priests with overgrown hair on their heads are punished with kares. And the Baraisa continues, but a priest who performs a temple service while uncircumcised, you might have thought this would also be kares, but it's not. A priest who is a priest, his father was a priest, but for some reason he was not circumcised, it could be that it was medically dangerous, and if he would have been circumcised, it would have killed him, so he's an uncircumcised priest. That's okay. He's a Jew. If it's a medical necessity not to circumcise, then you don't circumcise because life above all. So if it would be risking his life to circumcise, he's not circumcised. But if he's a priest who's uncircumcised, even for a medical necessity, he can't serve in the holy temple. Or a priest who is an acute mourner, known as an Onein, right, or an Onein. So who is that? That's a priest whose close relative died that day. Right? So he's not allowed to serve in the temple that day. Or a priest who performs a temple service while seated. Interesting. Seated. Right? They have to be standing and barefoot, by the way, when they're serving in the holy temple. I can already hear someone asking, well, what if he is paralyzed and he serves in a wheelchair? Actually, that would not work, because a priest also cannot be blemished, and that would be considered a blemish. It's not fair. It's not nice. It's not the way we think about things. But it sounds like, no matter what the reason, a priest who cannot serve, cannot bring the service while he is seated. Then you might ask, well, what if he could do, there are standing wheelchairs that you could move him around and he's standing. But I think then there would still be the problem that he's blemished. But we're not talking about blemish yet. But a priest who performs a temple service while uncircumcised, or as an acute mourner, or while seated, his punishment is not kares. It's not permitted. He is liable for violating a prohibition. But if he does this intentionally, his punishment would be lashes, right? And there's no kares involved. So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that it is prohibited for an uncircumcised priest to perform the temple service? Rav Chisda says, this matter we did not learn from the Torah of Moses, our teacher. It was not learned until Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, right, the prophet, came and taught it to us. As it is stated, no foreigner uncircumcised in heart or uncircumcised in flesh may enter my temple. Ezekiel 44:9. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in now. And I'm at the top of page 84a. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive that it is prohibited for an acute mourner priest to perform the temple service? It is derived from a verse, as it is written with regard to a high priest whose mother or father died, quote, and from the temple he shall not emerge, and he shall not desecrate the temple of his God, Leviticus 21:12. From which it may be inferred that another, who is not a high priest, but an ordinary priest, who did not emerge from the temple, and who continued to perform the service, has desecrated the service. And Rav Ada said to Rav, and let us derive it by means of a verbal analogy. Derive the meaning of the term chilul, written with regard to an acute mourner who performs the temple service, from the term chilul, written with regard to an impure priest who partakes of teruma. Just as there with regard to teruma he is punished with kares, so too here, with regard to an acute mourner who performs the temple service, he should be punished with kares. We're saying it's not kares. Why not? And Rav answers, is desecration written with regard to the matter of a priest who performs the temple service when he's an acute mourner? It is derived from that which is written with regard to the high priest by inference. Therefore, it is a matter that emerges from an inference. And the principle is, any matter that emerges from an inference cannot be derived by means of a verbal analogy. A verbal analogy can be derived only when the matter is written explicitly. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that it is prohibited for a priest who is seated to perform the temple service? Rava says that Rav Nachman says the verse states, for him has the Lord chosen from among all your tribes to stand and minister in the name of the Lord, Deuteronomy 18:5. God states in the verse that I choose him for service while he is standing, but not for service while he is seated. So a priest cannot perform a temple service while he is sitting down. That's what I've got for us today. I know that Nina is very busy getting ready for Shabbos guests. I'm not sure she can scan for questions, but it sounds like no questions or comments. So, good Shabbos, my holy sisters and brothers. May we be blessed to go into Shabbos in peace, to be uplifted by the light of Shabbos, to be refreshed by the spirituality and sustenance of Shabbos, and to come out of Shabbos hearing only good news. We say Amen. All the best. Good Shabbos. And see you tomorrow. See you tomorrow after Shabbos ends in LA. And I just wanted to mention special time on Sunday. Have another one of these screenings, so it's going to be noon Pacific on Sunday. But we'll announce that again in class tomorrow night, and some more special schedule next week. Okay, good Shabbos.